And happy first day of the week, everyone. I hope everyone had a wonderful day, particularly if you are a follower of Christ, if you spent some time in worship today and following after the will of God. He has told us to worship Him on the first day of the week. I was able to meet this morning with a small congregation here in town, and had a really good lesson and some singing, and took the Lord's Supper and had the contribution, some prayer, just all the things still going on, and getting to know some brethren from other parts of town. So very cool day today doing that. So looking forward to this tonight and pretty much every night that I do this. I really have been getting a lot out of doing these videos. I do them, I guess, mainly for me to give me motivation to continue to study nearly every day. I do study every day, but I don't necessarily do these videos every day. But this has really kind of helped me stay motivated to do that. And talking with brothers and sisters that we exchange private messages and stuff on a fairly constant basis. Just talking Bible. All this COVID stuff's got everything stirred up. As a lot of people are looking to understand Revelation and how it might relate to the things going on. Of course, I don't believe Revelation has anything to do with what's going on right now in any specific detail. But those questions fly back and forth, and so it's always fun to talk about those. But tonight we're going to talk about Genesis chapters 40 and 41. 40 is pretty short. 41 is fairly long, but both of these are stories that we heard growing up in Bible class, if you had that opportunity. And so there's not going to be too much in the way of digging deep kind of stuff, because we're all familiar with these stories. So anyway, I'll be reading out of the King James. Have the ESV open for some modern English phrasing, and then I've got the Hebrew open as is necessary. Welcome aboard, Tom. Glad to see you tonight. So we're going to get started here in Genesis chapter 40 and verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. Now, one of the big takeaways that I got from this, first of all, again, Joseph was put into kind of a high-end prison here, where you had more in the way of what we might call white-collar criminals, people who had committed more like a political trespass, or these guys weren't violent criminals. And so the place that they were put, we don't read about anybody in here that was like a murderer or like a thief or something along those lines. These guys are very, very high-end servants that we're seeing being put in here. And the butler and the baker both did something that upset Pharaoh, and of course one of them gets restored. So there's a lot to be said about the nature of this prison. But the thing that I got out of this that I thought was very, very interesting is the way that this is talked about. And we're going to see it here, and we're going to see it again in a little bit in chapter 41. But, oh man, I do not have COVID. But I have been talking all day. I've been playing with my kids, and we've been out and about, and it is kind of allergy season. I tend to dry out a little bit, so... But what I got out of this is the way that the phrasing here is presented. The captain of the guard, we're talking about the prison, and it says, put them in the ward in the house of the captain of the guard. And that that phrasing there is very, very interesting to me, because we read about in Acts chapter 16 the Philippian jailer. And if you look over there, and I think I have an article about this on my webpage, but if you look over at Acts chapter 16, this Philippian jailer has been put in charge of Paul and Silas. And starting in you could read the whole chapter, but they are cast into prison in verse 23. They prayed, they sang, the prisoners heard them. So these guys, these two Christians are in there talking, worshiping God, and then there's an earthquake, and you guys are probably familiar with this story. And the keeper of the prison wakes out of his sleep, sees the prison doors open, and he's about to kill himself. And Paul's like, no, don't do anything. We're all here. And so he calls for a light, and he comes in, and he falls down before Paul and Silas. And he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" So apparently the jailer's been listening to all the things that Paul and Silas have been teaching, because he asked a question that implies that they've been teaching about this. And so they say, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved, and thy house." And they spake unto him the word of the Lord, and to all that were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night, and washed their stripes, and was immersed, he and all his straightway. And when he had brought them into his house, he set meat before them, and rejoiced, believing in God with all his house. And when it was day, the magistrates sent the sergeant, saying, "Let these men go." And the keeper of the prison told this, saying to Paul, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace." So the story that I have heard all of my life, and I still continue to hear, this is a very common understanding of this passage, is that in Acts 16, Paul and Silas are worshiping and they're teaching. And the earthquake happens. They prevent the jailer from killing himself. And then the jailer takes them out of the prison to his house, where he lives with his wife and his children, washes their stripes, is immersed, and then somehow takes them back to the jail, and they're there to be released in the morning. And so it's his whole household, his family, that gets converted. And a lot of people come here and they say, the Philippian jailer's whole house was converted, and they'll try to bring in infant baptism and all that kind of nonsense. But if you understand this correctly, the guy was going to kill himself because he thought that the prisoners had left the jail after the earthquake had opened up all the doors. He would not then logically take prisoners out of the jail to his house where his kids are. That makes no sense. "Hey, Mom, welcome aboard." And so the way that the phrasing here, and it struck me in Genesis 40, is that this house and the household are this building where the jailer works. And the house, and if you look at the original Greek, I didn't look it up tonight, but if you look at I think it's oikos, the way that oikos can be interpreted is those under your charge. And so, hey, Art, welcome aboard. We're in Genesis 40, but I'm discussing the phrasing of the idea of the word house when we're talking about the jailer and the prisoners that are in his care and under his authority. And in Acts 16, we see that it makes far more sense that the Philippian jailer takes Paul and Silas into his little office there at the jail, cleans their wounds, and then puts them back in their cell after he is immersed, and all of the prisoners that obeyed the gospel, the ones that were immersed into Christ as well. I have held that for a very long time. It usually is not a very popular understanding of this, but there isn't any reason not to believe that. It doesn't go against any doctrines or anything. It just goes against a traditional teaching that somehow the jailer takes Paul and Silas out of the jail, home to his wife and kids. The whole family is immersed into Christ, including the little babies, and then he takes them back to jail. Why does that make sense? I've never understood why that makes sense. And so reading here in Genesis chapter 40, seeing this, this is the first time just studying for this tonight, where this just kind of jumped out at me. that the same phrasing is used. He put them in ward. This is 40 verse 3, Genesis 40 verse 3. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard. Well, he didn't put them in his house in terms of where his family lives. He puts them in the building where this guy has charge of these prisoners. Because it says, in ward, in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And so when we read about a house, we aren't necessarily reading about a place where you live if you look at the original language. And so we're talking about the prison here. We're talking about the captain of the guard and those that are in his charge, including Joseph and now the cupbearer, or as it says in the King James, the butler and the baker. So there's no candlestick maker, though I looked. Verse 4, and the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued to season and ward. So, again, the captain of the guard has Joseph over everything, doesn't even really pay attention. He trusts Joseph enough. He just kind of says, all right, Joseph, you get 2 more. And Joseph takes him on, and everything goes good for a season. In verse 5, hey, Tracy, welcome aboard. In verse 5, and they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house. Again, there's that idea. He's in the house of the Lord. In this particular case, talking about the jailer, saying, wherefore look ye so badly today, or so sadly today. Hey, Paulette, welcome aboard. And they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And so they've had these dreams, and they're sad about them. They don't understand what they mean. They're obviously important. We have dreams all the time, but the dreams that we have are typically our mind just kind of defragging from the day's events or the week's events or whatever. And they don't have any meaning. So these dreams obviously stood out to these men, and so they're sad because they don't have the interpretation. Plus, this was a time where there was a lot of mysticism, and so they did have Jehovah. We know Jehovah talked to a lot of people in their dreams, so this was a thing that was known to happen, at least with Jehovah God, because all the other gods are just fake inanimate objects that men made. But they're sad about it. And so Joseph's like, well, the interpretations belong to God. Let me hear what your dreams are, and maybe God will tell me what they mean. And so the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, now understand, between verses 11 and 12, we aren't told how much time takes place. Is Joseph just given instant understanding of the dreams because God is with him? Does Joseph go off and pray and ask like Daniel had to do? We're not told. We can't say more than what the scriptures say themselves. But it just says that Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up your head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. So here we're seeing the providence of God. Hey, Carrie. God is sending these 2 men dreams. Both dreams are true. Both dreams are something that God gives Joseph to know the interpretation of them. And Joseph tells the butler, the cupbearer, hey, when everything's settled down and everything is going good for you, don't forget about me in here, because I was put in here unjustly. I didn't do anything. I got stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and I have been falsely accused, and here I am in jail. So please remember me to say something to Pharaoh about it, because I helped you out. And so when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. So the dreams come true, the interpretations that Joseph gives them come true. Butler is restored, but he forgets about Joseph. For whatever reason. And again, here is the providence of God. What would have been the case if the butler had remembered Joseph and talked to Pharaoh about it, and then Joseph had been released to go about his way? But instead, he's left in prison for 2 more years. Hey, Stephen, welcome aboard. He's left in there for 2 more years, and in this instance, because of that, he is given a great opportunity, even though he was in bondage for those 2 extra years. So again, there's a kind of a providential aspect to this, not a supernatural one in the case of being left in there. So tower defense, nice. So anyway, that's where we're going to be in chapter 41. So let's get into chapter 41. Again, these stories are not unknown to us. These are things that I'm sure all of us have heard growing up, going to Bible class most of our lives. So I'm not spending too much time trying to dig too deep into them. So chapter 41, verse 1, And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine, that's cattle, and flat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the bank of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke. And he slept and dreamed the 2nd time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. So that word rank there is not like stinky. It having like of good rank, of high rank. They're plump. They're full. So, anyway, the 7 thin ears, verse 7, devoured the 7 rank and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. So one of the interesting things, and this is kind of definitely speculation, and kind of going to go down a bit of a rabbit trail here for a minute, but I am a physics teacher, and I talk about the origins of electricity and whatnot. And every year I always ask, hey Arthur, I always ask my students who discovered electricity. And of course, invariably they're going to say like Ben Franklin or Thomas Edison, which Ben Franklin is public school teaching. Thomas Edison is completely incorrect. But we definitely have direct evidence that electricity had been used well earlier than that. There's the evidence that they used it in the 600s AD with the Baghdad battery. They found jars with a lining of metal and then a rod of a different kind of metal down in the middle. And acid etching, well, two metals and an acid is a battery. We know that in the 200s BC, the Greeks were already electroplating jewelry. They had arc lights. The lighthouse at Alexandria had an arc light there. So we know that electricity was used at least that far back. But if you go to a place called Dendera, there is the Temple of Hathor there, and that is the temple of these wise men that we're talking about, these magicians of Pharaoh. And the thing about the temple at Dendera is that if you if you stumbled upon it and even saw it like afar off, the guards there would hunt you down and kill you, so that you could not report even the location of this place. That's how secretive they were, because what was going on there. Oh wow, I did not know that. I know he was a tool. I know he stole a lot of his stuff from Tesla, but I've never liked Edison. Not since I was old enough to have studied him in any kind of detail, but to know he was a eugenicist, that's even worse. But anyway, this place was where all of the secrets of the Magi for Pharaoh were kept. Well, Dendera was dug up not too long ago, a few decades ago, and they found a lot of kind of the ancient secrets where their magic wasn't really magic. It was what we would call kind of advanced technology in the sense of the people of that day. It's not advanced for us, but it was for them. And they found some interesting pictographs in there that look a whole lot like electricity and light bulbs. And you can just imagine the peasants coming in to petition Pharaoh. They come in and they're bearing their gift, and Pharaoh sees them come in, and he stands up, and suddenly there's this divine glow behind him, and the person doesn't know any better, sees this glow. They fall down and they worship Pharaoh because he's a god king. And so that was something that was, all monarchies are actually oligarchies, and there's this kind of agreement between the figurehead and then the people behind that. So Pharaoh is just one man. If they wanted to, they could depose him, but he works with his magi and whatever. And so the idea that they may have had electricity and they used that, they didn't share their knowledge, they used that to perpetuate this tyrannical government, is possible. I'm not saying there's enough evidence. I would like to go there one day and see for myself. But I do know that the pictures look a whole lot like a Crookes tube, or what do they call it? A gauze. Was it a gauze machine or a gauze bulb or something like that? But anyway, it was just interesting to me that they had that kind of technology, even that as far back as at least 200 BC. So that always, every time I read about Pharaoh's magicians and all the tricks, especially when we get into Moses and stuff in Exodus and all the stuff they did, I know it's just sleight of hand. Hey Rose, welcome aboard. I know it's not real. It's not supernatural. There's always an explanation, and you kind of see that if you've ever watched the DreamWorks, the Prince of Egypt, where Moses is given all these supernatural things to show Pharaoh, and then the magicians can do their little tricks. Theirs are all shown to be like kind of sleight of hand type stuff. They put the powder in the water and suddenly the water is kind of a red color. Whereas when God does it, it's actual blood rather than just red colored water. And they could take the snakes and they could do a thing where they do the nerves and they become as rigid as a staff and they look like a staff. And so they could wake him up, and that's where the snakes that they gave, or that they showed that they could do the same thing that Moses could do, but his was actually a wooden staff, and ended up eating theirs, which Pharaoh, I guess, kind of ignored. But anyway, it's just interesting, and putting those things together and trying to understand what all was kind of going on behind the scenes for these guys, because we know Pharaoh was just a man. We know that they did not have supernatural abilities. There was nothing of any of these nations that were not tied directly to Jehovah that truly were supernatural. They would just make stuff up. They made up their gods. They were fake gods. They carved them out. Their so-called magic and their wisdom. Looking at Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar really pulls a fast one on his wise men. He's like, really, if you have the power to tell me what a dream means, you should have the power to tell me what the dream was. And none of his wise men could do it, because if you tell somebody what a dream is, then you can just make up whatever, and you can be generic enough that it's not gonna come out as wrong, because, well, I really meant this, you just understood it wrong or whatever. But Nebuchadnezzar is like, no, you tell me what the dream was, and then I'll know you can tell me what the true interpretation is. And only Daniel could do that, because it was really God doing it. So just a little bit of that, and we're going to see the same thing here with Joseph. So anyway, he tells in verse 8, he says, he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. So none of what they said, they either said we can't do it, or none of what they said made sense, and Pharaoh was still like, no, that's not right, or whatever. And so then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was with us a young man, a Hebrew servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass as he interpreted to us. So it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. So the butler finally remembers, oh yeah, Joseph, this guy interpreted my dream accurately, and here Pharaoh's got a dream. Nobody can interpret it. Maybe this guy Joseph can. And so he tells Pharaoh about it. So Pharaoh was like, what I got to lose. Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it, and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. So, some comments here. Stephen, I'll go back and find the source for it. Yeah, definitely, please pass that on to me. Yeah, he definitely, Nebuchadnezzar was, I really like him. I honestly think there's a good chance that Nebuchadnezzar may have become a follower of Jehovah towards the end of his life. I think that would be really cool if he did, given all that God did with him and kind of for him, showing him, hey, I'm really the God that is God. So, but yeah, I like Nebuchadnezzar a lot. Verse 16, and Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. So Joseph here is again this honest follower of God. He doesn't take the glory onto himself. He says, I don't have anything to do with it. It's God that does that. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And so Pharaoh says unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. So Pharaoh's never seen any cows that were that lean, that were that bad off. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as at the beginning. So I awoke. So he has this dream, and after the thin cows eat the fat cows, it doesn't look like they've done anything, because they were still so thin. And so he wakes up, and then he has another dream. I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears, and I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. So he tells them both dreams. Talks tells them both dreams, and then he says, I told it to all my magicians, but nobody could say what the dreams meant. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. So he's like, they're the same message. God has showed Pharaoh what God, is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he's showing it to Pharaoh. So Joseph says God is the one that can interpret the dreams. And then Joseph said, this is something that God is about to do. We're seeing here that Joseph is knowing that God has a direct hand in this. And why is God doing this? We're seeing here that God is removing the Israelites from Canaan during a time period where the Canaanites are going to complete or fulfill their wickedness. They're going to become the holy wicked nations that God knew they were going to become, but he's removing them like he removed Lot from out of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's removing the Israelites from out of those nations so that they can fill up their wickedness without corrupting the Israelite nation. He's going to bring them into Egypt. Now, a lot of people say that this is for 430 years, but it's not. It's actually about half that time that they're there. There's only about 4 generations of people. The first generation that's already started and moves into Egypt, and then their children, and then their children, and then they have the older generation, that third generation there, has children, and both of them are the ones that leave, and I'll go over that when we get into Exodus. We'll talk about the timeline and the ancestry and why it could have only been about 215-ish years that they were in captivity. But anyway, during those 200 years, Canaan, the countries or the nations that are in Canaan become these fully evil, sinful nations that need to be destroyed because of their wickedness, very, very akin to what Sodom and Gomorrah were, very akin to what the people were before the flood. And we're going to see a lot of that is not just, it's not genocide so much as Stephen and I have been talking about it, and he's shown me that it's more about driving them out and scattering them to where they kind of diffuse or disperse their wickedness, as opposed to just completely and totally eradicating it. There's a lot of evidence that God isn't actually calling for genocide there. So anyway, this is what Joseph says, is this is God is going to do this. And Pharaoh, he's kind of showing you that this is what he's about to do. He says, behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following. In other words, it's going to be so bad afterwards that nobody's going to remember the 7 good years, for it's going to be really, really bad. Which is, the fat cows being consumed by the thin ones, and then the thin ones didn't get any better. They completely consumed, the bad years completely consumed the good years, and it's like the good years never happened. So, so anyway, verse 32, and for that dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, it is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. In other words, Joseph is saying, because you had the same message in 2 different dreams, that's to show you that God is talking to you, and it's not just a random dream that you're having. You had 2 completely different dreams with the exact same message. That's telling you that it's from God. So that's what that verse means. And for the dream was, and it was because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now, quick question for you. When the Bible says that something is shortly going to be brought to pass, or shortly to come to pass, are we waiting? Was Joseph and Pharaoh going to wait 2,000 years for that thing to happen? Were these 14 years, 7 good years and 7 bad years, it says here that they're going to shortly be brought to pass, that God is going to shortly bring them to pass. Were they waiting 2,000 years later for these things to happen? I'm just asking. Because when God is speaking to people and he says it's going to shortly come to pass, there's a lot of people that want to go to 2 Peter 3 and say 1,000 years is a day and a day is 1,000 years. So really what God is talking about in the book of Revelation when he says shortly come to pass and the time is at hand and behold I come quickly over and over and over and over again, what he really means is 2,000 years later. And so they try to interpret Revelation to mean in our time. Well, here God says this thing is going to shortly come to pass. Joseph understood it. Pharaoh understood it. I understand it to mean it was about to happen. And so when I read things like that in other places, God is an effective communicator. He created language. God does not create or does not communicate to us in terms that are kind of wishy-washy or confusing or anything. He communicates to us in terms that pertain to us from our perspective so that we can understand them. And so when he says here to Joseph and Pharaoh, these things are going to shortly come to pass, he meant they were shortly going to come to pass. They were about to happen. And the same thing is true in Revelation. When John writes in the very first verse of the whole book that this was sent and signified by his angel about things that were shortly come to pass, he meant they would shortly come to pass. Why? Because in verse 3, Revelation 1:3, the time is at hand. And so the events of Revelation were about to happen. In fact, if you look at the correct dating of Revelation, the events were already in motion. They were already started when John actually received this, and he gets it to those 7 congregations. Those were the 7 closest congregations to where he was on the island of Patmos. So just a little bit of the Bible interpreting itself here. We understand shortly bring it to pass to mean it was about to happen here. It's the same thing when we read about it in other places in the Bible. And this isn't in the necessarily apocalyptic sense either. We're not talking about any of the apocalyptic texts. We're just talking about historical text of Genesis. So verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up a 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and let them gather up all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through famine. So Joseph said, here's what you got to do. You got to find some dude you can trust, and you put him in charge, and you're going to take up 1/5, 20% of everything that's produced by your nation. Of course, this is a dictatorship, so they can do that. In a republic, that's not going to fly so well. But here it's a dictatorship, so this isn't that big of a deal for them. And so he says, you find somebody you can trust, put them in charge, get them to do this, Egypt will be fine. Pharaoh's like, that's a great idea. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Pharaoh's kind of asking a leading question here. I think Pharaoh already knows the answer to his question. So Stephen says, Deuteronomy 9:3, understand today that Jehovah your God is he who goes over before you and is a consuming fire. He will destroy them and bring them down before you, so you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly. Yeah, drive them out. So that's what we were talking about. That it isn't necessarily all about genocide. Is driving them out, scattering them. So yeah, shortly come to pass. I like that analogy. Grab some popcorn, drink, take a seat, mute your phones. The show is about to get started. Love it. That's exactly right. So anyway, Pharaoh's like, where are we going to find a guy like this in whom the Spirit of God is? Well, he just realized that Joseph was able to correctly interpret those dreams. So Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God has showed you all of this, there is none so discreet and wise as you. So there's the answer to the rhetorical question. Where are we going to find a guy like this? Joseph, you're the guy. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh makes him number 2 in all of Egypt. He's like mini me. He's the second most powerful man in Egypt. So he goes from sold slave to prisoner to second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Man, that's God working for certain there. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Whew. Man, talking about a change in the winds of fortune. God is definitely with Joseph here. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So in other words, Joseph, I'm putting you in charge, and there ain't nobody going to act on their own. They're going to do exactly what you tell them to do. Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah. I had to practice that one when I was younger to get that one right. Pretty good at it now, but Zaphnath-Paneah. And he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. That Potiphar and Potiphar are not the same person. It's just one of those names that kind of repeats. The priest of On, which is one of the Egyptian deities. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. All right, so I'm going to stop there. This Pharaoh seems like a pretty cool guy. Treated Joseph well, and even Joseph's people gave them choice land to dwell in. He does sound like he's got his head on straight. Reminds me more of like a Claudius or maybe an Augustus or even a Julius. The Caesars, they had their good sides and their bad sides. Some of them were actually fairly good guys. Some of them, Nero was completely off his rocker. This guy is, I'm not saying he's all good, but he definitely is a little bit more level-headed, if you will. Zaphnath-Paneah is basically Fred in Egypt. I love it. Thank you, Art. He does seem like a pretty good guy, but unfortunately there's a new dynasty that rises up. Likely God had a little bit of a hand in that because the children of Israel needed a kick out of Egypt. They needed a reason to go out and go take over the land that God had promised them. So, but right now, God's taking care of them. So, but I did want to mention briefly, Joseph is a great guy. He is a follower of God. He believes in God. He definitely is one of those guys that we read about that doesn't really do anything wrong that's written in Scripture. Don't know if he was sinless individually, but he's definitely a solid guy like Abraham. But he is given the daughter of a priestess of one of the Egyptian gods, and when that happens, there is an influence that happens there. And Joseph's really strong, and I don't know that Joseph himself was ever I don't know that Joseph himself was ever led astray by her. We don't have anything in Scripture that says that and whatnot. But we can see that over the course of time, the tribes of Joseph's two sons, because he gets two half-tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, they become wicked. And I have to wonder if this marrying into, hey Judy, welcome aboard. We're about halfway through Genesis, most of the way through Genesis 41. But I have to wonder if this Asenath had some kind of a corrupting influence going forward on the sons of Joseph and eventually those tribes, so that they ended up siding with the northern kingdom and eventually were under all of those wicked kings. Every time we read about this where there is that the purity is not maintained, then the people of Israel are led astray by these foreign gods, and problems arise. So, all right, verse 47. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls, And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea. Now, here's the interesting thing here. This phrase, sand of the sea, is something that is also used to talk about the children of Israel. It is a form of hyperbole. There's a lot of people that want to say, well, the sand and the sea, we're talking about trillions upon trillions upon trillions of particles. There's no way that the children of Israel ever fulfilled that. God never fulfilled that promise to them because they never had that many children. Well, he's talking about he's talking about this in terms that there's going to be a whole lot of them, many of them, but it's a form of hyperbole. And to try to make it into a literal thing is really quite problematic. The stars one is not so bad, because if you look up in the night sky from any given hemisphere, there's only a few thousand stars that you can see with the naked eye, and they didn't have like telescopes and stuff. Galileo doesn't come along for a couple of thousand years later. So we're it's more of a literal interpretation there if we need it to be. But here we can see that seeing the corn as the grains of sand on the beach, they weren't really as the sand on the beach. That much corn, because corns are big kernels where sands are tiny particles, that much corn would have overflowed the whole continent of Africa. And so this is a form of hyperbole. We need to understand when the Bible is using hyperbole, especially when it talks about its prophetic visions. So anyway, let's see here. Where's it at here? Okay, verse 49. Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea very much until he left numbering, for it was without number. So he stopped counting. It was so much. They weren't even counting bags at this point. It's like there's just so much of it overflowing. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came. So he has 2 sons during these 7 plenteous years, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And I keep repeating that Asenath is the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, because I think it's important. Hey, Ashley, welcome aboard. We're in Genesis 41, verse 50. So there's something significant. Why does Moses keep repeating this? And I think it has to do, going back with the idea of the influence that these foreign women tend to have on the Israelites. So Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God said, He made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And then and the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So looking at the meanings of those names, let me pull those up here real quick. So Manasseh and Ephraim. Now Ephraim is interesting because Ephraim we read a lot about in the books of prophecy, especially the minor prophets, and it's not good. None of it is good. So Manasseh, causing to forget, is what his name means. And then Ephraim, double ash heap. I shall be doubly fruitful. So double ash heap. I wonder if there's a double entendre there. The double ash heap, of course, ash is thought of in terms of this as fertile. You use ash as kind of like a fertilizing substance. But being doubly fruitful, this is his second son, but there's also kind of a double entendre here with being in this fruitful time for Egypt, and how Joseph was made to forget his trials and all of the bad things he went through because he's been so blessed, and now he has the second son here. So I think there's a lot of play on words going on with Ephraim's name, but sadly, Ephraim in the later parts of the Old Testament will become to be associated with how wicked especially the northern tribes have become. So just throwing those out there, something to pay attention to as you read through the Old Testament. So verse 53, and the 7 years of plenteous that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands, but all the land of Egypt there was bread. So this famine is very widespread. It's all over the surrounding lands. But Egypt had bread because God had taken care of Joseph, and through Joseph had taken care of Egypt because they listened to God and the message that he had given to Pharaoh. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, go unto Joseph, and what he says to you, do. So they're starting to cry, oh my gosh, there's no more food. What do we do? And Pharaoh says, go talk to Joseph. He's the one in charge of this. He's been the one storing all this up. And you do exactly what he says to do because he has the right of it. And we'll see you through this. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. So is this a planet-wide famine? Is that what that means? I don't think so. This famine was over all the face of the land, the region. So when we see that word earth there, pay attention because it almost never means the whole planet. They didn't necessarily even understand their world in those terms. But this famine was over all of the land, all of the known world at that time, what we would call in the Greek the oikoumene, the kingdoms or the ruled land. And so this is a very widespread famine, but it's not necessarily one that is a full planet worth. That's not how Moses would have presented it to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in all the land. So here's the interesting thing is, not only is Egypt prepared to weather the 7 bad years, but they're going to grow really, really rich because of it, because all of the surrounding lands that are enduring this famine as well didn't know they were coming, didn't store up and prepare, and they have to come to Egypt now to buy food, and it's no choice. There's nowhere else to go, and so they come to Egypt and they buy the grain, they buy the corn to make their bread and all of their food. They got to feed their cattle. So it's a very important thing to understand that God, because Pharaoh took care of Joseph and listened to God, God takes care of Pharaoh in Egypt as well at this point in time. There is a bit of a lesson in here for us. Right, I agree. In Matthew 4, where Satan is tempting Jesus and he takes him up to a high pinnacle and shows him all the kingdoms of the world in an instant, he's not showing him a spherical planet. He's showing him all of the lands, the surrounding lands, the oikoumene is what he's showing. Great point, Stephen. I agree 100%. The inhabited land or the ruled over land. That oikoumene means kingdom or the empire or the ruled land of what they would call Caesar's house. Oikos, oikoumene, those are related words. So I 100% agree with you there. But there's a lesson here for us, maybe a lesson too late, as it were. There's a man named Dave Ramsey. I don't agree with his theology, but he has a lot of very good practical advice. He has studied the Bible in terms of managing money. And Dave Ramsey has some great advice that you should store up 3 to 6 months worth of your income. Like, I make about $3,700 a month. I should have 3 to 6 months of that paycheck stored up in case an emergency happens. I lose my job or some emergency comes up. And it's not a lesson that I've been able to learn very well, just to be frankly honest about it. And I don't want to make excuses, but the idea for me as a single income household, we've lived paycheck to paycheck. We finally actually started moving here to Tennessee. We've actually started getting ahead of our bills and getting things paid off and really trying to start to put stuff away. And then this shows up, and I am super grateful that I am still getting paid as a teacher. We got to start contacting our students tomorrow, and we're going to be doing all we can to facilitate them and be here just available for them to communicate. And I'm going to actually love that. I would love if the whole school year was like that, to where I could just facilitate, say, here's some things, go figure it out, and then if you can't, come back and ask me questions. I would love to be able to teach that way all the time, but we're doing it, thankful for it, and I'm also able to get a whole lot of other things done. Very grateful for that. But here, when you have plenty, and guys, I'm really preaching to myself here. I'm not. I may sound like I'm getting on a high horse here and preaching at you, but I'm looking at myself here in this camera picture, and I'm like you talking to me. When there's plenty, when there's good resources, and you aren't floundering, set aside. Here they set aside a fifth of everything that they brought in. And for me to be able to do that, to set aside enough to where I can build up 3 to 6 months worth, even a year's worth of whatever. What if I want to transition out of teaching? Well, I could do that. We could live on that budget and transition and have that safety net. It would be so easy to do that. But I'm not there yet. I don't have that much stored up. And so for me, it's hard. And if we had gotten to a point where suddenly we weren't getting paid anymore, I don't know what I would be able to do with my family, to the point of, like, I would be frightened. I would be afraid. And so, we've started putting back more and more. We're looking more and more to the future. We're not so worried about some of the debt that we have, because a lot of that's been kind of put on pause anyway. So we can take that money and we can store it away. But it depends on how you look at what's going on right now. For a lot of people, this is the 7 years of famine, and they did not use the 7 years of plenty to store anything up. We have here in the Western society this me, gimme, I want it now idea. And so as soon as we get money, we burn through it. And we need to take a step back. I don't normally like to look at passages of scripture and try to directly apply them first to us today, because they weren't written. The Bible was not written to us. This is Moses writing to the Israelites in the 40 years of wandering out in the wilderness. But when a lesson does present itself that, okay, this is the direct lesson to them, but there is also an application I can draw for myself as a very clear one, then this is there's so much to learn from the Old Testament, from the mistakes that the Israelites made, from the lessons that God was trying to teach them. There is so much value in the Old Testament, and unfortunately we've kind of gotten away from, I know at least in my own faith, there's a lot of where we have gotten away from the Old Testament and trying to understand it and learn some of the big lessons that are in there, applied first to the Israelite nation, because that's who the Old Testament is written to and for, but just directly for us as well. So anyway, that's all I got. Thank you for being here tonight. We will try to hit 42, maybe 43 tomorrow night. Enjoyed going over this with y'all tonight, and I look forward, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll get to them. If you got something out of this, forward it or share it, and we look forward to talking with you guys again tomorrow night.